I did not refuse IMF loans because we don't need help. I refused because our help must first come from our own soil, or it will never come at all.
Captain Ibrahim Traore. In the heart of West Africa, a young soldier did something quiet but extraordinary. He said no, not in defiance but in dignity. No to debt without direction. No to partnerships without fairness. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traore, a 34-year-old artillery captain, stepped beyond his uniform and into history. This is not the story of a perfect leader. It is the story of a nation trying to stand on its own feet after generations of looking outward for answers. It's about courage in the face of crisis and vision in the face of uncertainty. From gold mines to schoolyards, from displaced families to dirt roads now paved by local hands, something is changing in Burkina Faso. And while the headlines speak of coups and crises, the real question runs deeper. Can a small landlocked nation chart its own course without asking for permission? If you still believe in justice, not just for one country, but for all, then stay with us. Because what you're about to hear will not only reshape how you see Africa, it might reshape how you see independence itself. Title: From Sankara to Traore, a legacy reawakens. To understand why Captain Ibrahim Traore's leadership resonates across Africa, we must begin not with him, but with the road that shaped him. In 1960, the country now called Burkina Faso gained independence from France. Back then, it was known as Upper Volta, a young nation with a hopeful flag but fragile foundations. Only 10% of its population could read or write. The economy relied almost entirely on exports it did not control. Foreign aid filled gaps that self-reliance never got the chance to patch. By the 1980s, a new figure rose, one that would leave a mark still felt today: Thomas Sankara. At just 33 years old, he seized power and renamed the country Burkina Faso, meaning Land of Upright People. Sankara promoted literacy, food sovereignty, women's rights, and mass vaccinations. He traveled on bicycles and cut government excess, not for headlines, but for principle. But bold ideas carry risks. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated. His successor reversed many of his reforms and reopened the doors to foreign influence. Over the next 3 decades, debt grew, resources flowed outward, and inequality deepened. Gold was exported, but poverty stayed. For many, the dream of Sankara died with him. But not for everyone. In 1988, a child named Ibrahim Traore was born in the western part of Burkina Faso. He grew up in the same soil Sankara once walked. He studied geology and joined the army. While others climbed political ladders, he remained close to the ground, often literally serving in remote combat zones. By 2022, the country was struggling again. Nearly 2 million citizens had been displaced by violence. Trust in institutions was low. Foreign troops were stationed on its soil, and the memory of Thomas Sankara hung in the air like a challenge waiting to be answered. Traore, just 34, and still a captain, stepped forward, not with slogans, but with a promise: we will reclaim our dignity, not through anger, but through action. The rise of Ibrahim Traore didn't happen overnight. It was the echo of a story long interrupted, now returning with new urgency. Captain Ibrahim Traore didn't walk into power through ceremony. He walked through dust, conflict, and the quiet collapse of a nation. In 2022, northern Burkina Faso was under siege. Armed groups, some local, some foreign, had launched more than 2,000 attacks since 2015. Villages vanished, roads turned into no man's lands. Nearly 2 million people, close to 1/10 of the population, were displaced. It was not a battle for power. It was a battle for presence. In this vacuum, Captain Traore, barely 34 years old, took a step that would define a new chapter. On September 30, 2022, his unit moved to the capital, and without firing a shot, the government was replaced. But what came next was not what the world expected. Traore didn't declare himself general. He didn't move into a palace. He remained a captain. And he chose to live on the same salary as his fellow soldiers. In a country where nearly half the population lives on less than $3 a day, this decision was more than symbolic. It was revolutionary. He ordered the removal of foreign troops stationed under counterterrorism agreements. For over a decade, 400 French soldiers had operated from military bases across Burkina Faso. By early 2023, they were ordered to leave. The decision stunned global observers, but to many Burkinabe, it made perfect sense. If the troops were effective, why had the violence only worsened? It wasn't just a rejection of foreign presence. It was a demand for accountability. Traore closed French media outlets accused of distorting facts. He insisted on national control over the narrative, believing that sovereignty isn't only about borders, it's also about the story a nation tells itself. Then came the volunteers. In October 2022, Traore launched a call to arms not to professional soldiers, but to everyday citizens. The goal was to recruit 50,000 volunteers for the defense of the homeland. In just weeks, more than 90,000 signed up. Farmers, teachers, students, mechanics, all willing to train for 2 weeks and take up basic weapons. It wasn't militarization. It was mobilization. For the first time since independence, the people weren't being protected. They were protecting themselves. Western observers criticized the program as unprofessional. Traore called it necessary. "We are not creating an army," he said. "We are rebuilding a nation." But bold moves bring bold risks. In September 2023, security services arrested several high-ranking officers suspected of plotting another coup. Rumors spread like wildfire. That night, the capital waited in silence. But by dawn, there he was, Captain Traore, standing beside loyal soldiers, speaking not as a ruler, but as a man who refused to hide. His calm presence only deepened public trust. Each threat didn't weaken him. It made him more real. By early 2024, he had suspended mining export licenses, cracking down on smuggling networks that siphoned millions from state coffers. He initiated the construction of Burkina Faso's first state-owned gold refinery, a quiet but monumental move in a country that exports nearly 70 metric tons of gold annually while remaining among the poorest in the world. At every step, the message was clear: wealth must first serve those who live closest to the land it comes from. Critics said it was anti-business. Supporters called it common sense. Then came a regional shockwave. In July 2024, Burkina Faso joined Mali and Niger in transforming the Liptako-Gourma Agreement into a new defense and cooperation pact, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES. Together, these three nations, once seen as vulnerable, formed a confederation of over 70 million people and 2 million square kilometers. The alliance promised mutual defense, shared development, and joint negotiation with foreign powers. And at the center of it stood a captain still in his same red beret, still earning the same wage, still refusing to act like a king. This wasn't a revolution made for cameras. It was a shift in posture. A country that once whispered for help now speaks for itself. And though challenges remain, violence, hunger, displacement, the people endure them not out of fear, but out of belief. Not because they've been promised paradise, but because for the first time they feel like they're building something real. And that, more than any speech, is what shook global capitals. Traore didn't need to shout. His restraint said enough. At first, many outside observers treated Ibrahim Traore's rise as just another chapter in Africa's long turbulent story. Another soldier, another coup, another uncertain future. But what unfolded in Burkina Faso challenged assumptions far beyond its borders. Because the real shift wasn't military, it was moral. Burkina Faso is the 15th largest gold producer in the world. Nearly 70 metric tons of gold are extracted from its soil every year. Yet for decades, this gold rarely stayed. Most of it was exported raw, unrefined. Billions of dollars passed through foreign companies while local communities remained without clean water schools or functioning hospitals. When Captain Traore's government announced the construction of a state-owned gold refinery in Ouagadougou, it didn't make front-page news, but it sent a quiet shockwave through boardrooms across Europe. For the first time, a landlocked African country was trying to refine its own wealth on its own terms. This wasn't just economics, it was sovereignty in action. By suspending export licenses for small-scale miners and targeting smuggling networks, the government aimed to stop what some called the silent drain millions, lost every year to informal routes and under-the-table deals. International critics warned of market disruptions, but at home, many saw it differently as a long-overdue correction. Still, the biggest surprise wasn't gold, it was alliance. In September 2023, Traore, alongside leaders from Mali and Niger, signed the Liptako-Gourma Charter, a mutual defense pact. Less than a year later, this evolved into the Alliance of Sahel States AES, a regional confederation representing more than 70 million people. For decades, France, the United States, and the European Union maintained influence in the region through diplomatic ties. Military bases and economic aid often channeled through organizations like ECOWAS. But the AES marked a turning point, 3 countries saying clearly and collectively, we will decide our future together. This was no declaration of hostility. It was a declaration of maturity. The implications ran deep. France began withdrawing its troops. Military advisors and ambassadors were sent home. Western media outlets, some respected, some criticized, were suspended. Even Voice of America was temporarily taken off the air. To Traore, it was about controlling the national story. To others, it was a red flag. International human rights groups raised concerns about media freedom and the treatment of journalists. Some wondered aloud, could a government fighting for independence also preserve liberty? But inside Burkina Faso, the view was different. Tens of thousands filled the streets in support of the reforms. For many, the presence of foreign troops had come to symbolize something painful, not partnership, but paternalism. And the media coverage from abroad often felt disconnected from the lived realities on the ground. The truth that emerged wasn't simple. Yes, difficult questions remain. Displacement continues. Attacks still occur. Economic hardship is real. But in the eyes of many Burkinabe, there's now something deeper than pain. There's purpose. For the first time in decades, citizens feel that the struggles they endure are no longer imposed from above or abroad. They are choices, difficult ones, but their own. And perhaps that's the most unsettling truth for the outside world. Not that a young captain seized power, but that millions are choosing to stand with him. Why? Because they see him not as a savior, but as a mirror. He walks among soldiers, not above them. He wears the same uniform. He lives modestly. He speaks plainly. And while he governs during one of the hardest chapters in the nation's modern history, he doesn't promise instant transformation. He promises effort. International leaders may view this through the lens of geopolitics, but ordinary people across Africa, and even in diaspora communities abroad, see something else, a different kind of leadership. One that says, we will stumble, but we will walk forward on our own feet. Traore's boldest act wasn't the refinery. It wasn't the expulsions. It wasn't the alliance. It was his refusal to become a politician as usual. And that's what caught the world off guard. Because if one small country, led by one young captain, can begin to take ownership of its resources, its narrative, and its alliances, then perhaps others can too. And that more than any speech, any press release, or any televised interview is what makes this moment historic. The road to sovereignty is never smooth, and for Burkina Faso, choosing to stand alone came with a price no budget line could capture. By the end of 2023, more than 2 million citizens had been displaced by armed conflict. That's nearly 1 in 10 people, mothers, children, elders, forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Entire villages in the north and east were emptied overnight. Markets once bustling with trade fell silent. Schools locked their gates. In some regions, normal life vanished. And yet, something surprising happened. When Captain Ibrahim Traore asked for 50,000 volunteers to defend the homeland, nearly twice that number signed up. Not out of obligation, but out of conviction. They were farmers, taxi drivers, teachers, shopkeepers, ordinary people with no formal training who stepped forward to defend the places they called home. They trained for 2 weeks. They received basic weapons. Some were barely adults. Others were fathers. Together, they became the local eyes and ears of the national defense strategy. Their presence gave remote communities a sense of hope, maybe fragile but real. These were not paid soldiers. They were neighbors. But hope doesn't cancel hunger. In 2024, Burkina Faso faced one of its worst food crises in recent memory. Over 3.5 million people required urgent humanitarian aid. Inflation in basic goods like rice cooking oil and soap hit families already struggling to survive. Displaced communities lived in makeshift camps depending on charity and limited government assistance. Clean water was scarce, medical care even scarcer. Yet despite these hardships, support for Traore's government remained remarkably strong. Why? Because for the first time in recent memory, people believed their suffering had a purpose. They weren't enduring for a foreign-backed project or a broken promise from abroad. They were enduring for themselves, their land, and their children's future. One woman in a rural village said it best: "My son died fighting. But he died protecting our soil, not working for a foreign company, not defending someone else's interest." That gives me peace. That sentiment, quiet, powerful, honest, echoes across the country. But peace of spirit does not fix broken infrastructure. Thousands of schools remained closed in conflict zones, leaving hundreds of thousands of children without education. Rural clinics lacked supplies. Government ministries, under pressure to prioritize defense, delayed essential public services. And as international aid groups scaled back over political disagreements, the humanitarian gap widened. The international community warned of authoritarian tendencies. Critics cited restrictions on media arrests of dissenting voices and the centralization of decision-making. Some worried that the promise of national dignity was coming at the cost of individual freedom. But inside Burkina Faso, the conversation was more complex. Citizens debated these issues, not as outsiders looking in, but as active participants. On the radio, in markets, in university halls, young people especially asked, "Can we rebuild a nation and safeguard freedoms at the same time? Is stability worth the sacrifice of full press access, or must both be non-negotiable?" There were no easy answers, but there was clarity on one thing. This time, the questions were theirs to ask. The consequences of Traore's rise weren't limited to Burkina Faso's borders either. His leadership inspired protests and solidarity marches in Mali, Niger, and even parts of Senegal. African diaspora communities in Paris, Brussels, and Washington held vigils waving both Burkinabe and Pan-African flags. A message was spreading not just about one man, but about a principle: the dignity to decide for yourself, even when the price is high. No one pretends that Burkina Faso is now a model of perfection. The country faces immense challenges: security, economic, humanitarian. But it is a nation in motion, not in submission. A country not waiting to be rescued, but reaching for self-rescue. And in that pursuit, the consequences may be painful. But for many, they are worth enduring. Because sometimes the cost of standing up is far less than the cost of staying down. Burkina Faso is a landlocked country with fewer than 23 million people. Its economy is small. Its roads are dusty. Its army modest. And yet, across boardrooms in Europe, offices in Washington, and media rooms around the world, this unassuming nation has become the subject of growing attention. Why? Because its new direction is not just political. it's philosophical. Captain Ibrahim Traore's leadership represents a challenge not just to former colonial powers, but to the assumptions baked into the post-Cold War global order that small nations must choose between dependence or collapse. That sovereignty is a theory, not a strategy. That development must follow a script written elsewhere. What Burkina Faso is attempting is different. By withdrawing French troops, challenging mining contracts, building local infrastructure, and joining hands with Mali and Niger to form the alliance of Sahel states, Traore's government is not rejecting cooperation. It is redefining it. These actions raise a deeper strategic question. Can a nation defend its autonomy without becoming isolated? Traore has positioned Burkina Faso not as an enemy of the West, but as a student of its own history. His speeches often cite the paradox many African nations face, possessing vast mineral wealth, yet remaining among the poorest. To him, the solution is not charity, it's renegotiation. And that idea is catching on. The AES alliance is a case in point. While it began as a mutual defense pact, it has slowly evolved into something more, an experiment in coordinated regional policy. The Confederation aims to standardize trade rules, share security intelligence, and manage collective resources. By pooling sovereignty, these nations hope to strengthen it. It's a strategy rooted in realism. Individually, these countries struggle to stand against economic pressures or political sanctions, but as a bloc of over 70 million people, covering more than 2 million square kilometers and rich in gold, uranium, and agricultural potential, they're hard to ignore. And unlike Cold War-era alliances, the AES is not explicitly pro-East or anti-West. It is pragmatist. Russia has extended security support. China has shown interest in infrastructure, but the message remains: we will partner on terms that respect us, not control us. This realignment reflects a broader global shift away from binary alliances and toward flexible coalitions. As multipolarity becomes the new norm, small nations are seeking ways to assert agency without inviting isolation. Traore's Burkina Faso is one of the boldest examples of this. But such boldness invites risk. The challenge now is sustaining credibility, not just abroad, but at home. Can his administration deliver results before frustration outweighs faith? Can institutions be strengthened without silencing dissent? Can gold refineries and volunteer brigades translate into durable peace and jobs? The answers are still unfolding. But what's clear is that the rest of Africa is watching. In Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal youth-led movements are increasingly questioning the legitimacy of foreign military bases, debt structures, and extractive industries. In this context, Burkina Faso becomes more than a country. It becomes a case study. And for Western nations, the question isn't whether to approve of Traore. It's whether they're ready to adapt to a new Africa, one that negotiates, not pleads. One that organizes, not waits. One that asks not for charity, but for fairness. This shift does not require Western guilt. It requires Western listening. There is an opportunity here, not for division, but for dialogue. For example, partnerships that focus on clean energy tech education and decentralized health systems could align better with what African nations actually want. Not handouts, just equal footing. Burkina Faso, with all its limitations, is asking hard questions, not just of itself, but of a global system that often rewards compliance over courage. And perhaps that's the deepest strategic insight of all. Because in a world facing rising inequality, climate shocks, and shifting alliances, the leaders who will matter most may not be those with the biggest armies or budgets, but those who inspire others to rethink the rules. That is what makes Captain Traore so significant. Not his uniform, not his speeches, but the way his actions force everyone, friend or critic, to revisit a simple idea. What if dignity is not a dream? What if it's a policy to those who marched in Selma? To those who questioned the war in Vietnam? To those who remembered Watergate, who spoke out during COINTELPRO, who believed that truth must always have a place at the table. This story is yours too, because what's happening in Burkina Faso is not a rejection of the world. It's a call for a fairer one. A young captain barely in his 30s chose not power, but humility. He asked not for applause, but participation. He did not claim to have all the answers, but he dared to say, "Let us ask the questions ourselves." There are no saints in politics, no perfect paths, but there are moments that force us to remember why we care. And this right here is one of them. So we ask you, if you ever believed in freedom, not the kind written in speeches, but the kind paid for in sweat and sacrifice, then pay attention to what's happening now. Don't dismiss it as distant. Don't wait for headlines to catch up. Instead, listen, learn, share. Because if Africa rises with dignity, the whole world rises with it. If the courage of Captain Ibrahim Traore speaks to your heart, if you believe Burkina Faso deserves to be more than a footnote, if you still believe that justice is not just a memory, but a mission, then stand with truth, stand with hope, and stand with the people who dare to stand for themselves. Subscribe, because what you just heard will never make the evening news, but it might just rewrite history.